Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today we are going to embark on an archaeological journey through literature and history to unearth the true identity of one of the most famous characters in the world, Merlin. When we hear his name, it is almost inevitable that the first image that comes to mind is that of a venerable old man with a long white beard, dressed in a blue robe and a pointed hat. This is the version that pop culture, and specifically Disney, has tattooed on our collective consciousness. The kind, slightly absent-minded wizard who serves as a mentor to the future king. However, that image is only the most superficial layer of a story that has been building for more than 1,500 years. The reality is that there is no single Merlin. His legend is a puzzle that has changed radically depending on the century and the author. Sometimes he is a wizard, sometimes a madman, sometimes an architect, and other times a cursed being. To truly understand who he is, we must forget for a moment the magic of colors and travel back in time to the Dark Ages when myths were born. Our journey begins in the 6th century in the lands of what is now Wales and southern Scotland. The character we call Merlin did not come out of nowhere. He is the literary fusion of two real historical figures. The first of these was a man named Myrddin Wyllt. This man did not shoot lightning bolts from his hands. He was a bard, a Welsh poet. His life changed forever in 573 AD during a traumatic event known as the Battle of Arderith. What Myrddin saw on that battlefield was such appalling carnage that his mind broke. He went mad and fled into the woods to live like a wild animal far from civilization. In Latin chronicles, he began to be called Merlinus Sylvestris, or Merlin of the Woods. Legend has it that in his state of madness, he acquired the gift of prophecy, since in ancient times it was believed that insanity opened the doors to divine vision. But Myrddin is only half the story. The other half comes from a Romano-British military leader named Ambrosius Aurelianus. The analysis of his name is revealing. Ambrosius comes from ambrosia, the food of the immortals, and Aurelianus derives from aurum, meaning gold. So we have a figure of authority known as the Golden Immortal. Originally, Ambrosius Aurelianus served as the basis for the early stories of King Arthur, but over the centuries and through oral tradition, the character fragmented and eventually merged with the Mad Bard to create the prototype of Merlin that we know today. We take a giant leap forward in time to the year 1137. This is where Merlin formally enters literature thanks to a monk named Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote The History of the Kings of Britain. This book tells the story of King Vortigern, a monarch who was trying to build a great fortress, but he faced a mystery. Every day, his men would build the walls of the tower, and every night, the walls would collapse without explanation. The king's advisors told him that to solve the problem, he must sacrifice a child who had no father and mix his blood with the cement. The king found that child, Merlin. But the young man, far from being frightened, laughed at the advisors and revealed the truth. The tower did not fall because of a lack of magic, but because there was an underground lake beneath the earth where two dragons slept, one white and one red. When they awoke, these beasts fought each other, causing the earth to shake. Merlin explained that the white dragon represented the Saxon invaders and the red dragon represented Wales, a political prophecy that remains valid even in the current flag of Wales. It is in this same book that Merlin facilitates the conception of King Arthur. Through magical rituals, he disguises King Uther Pendragon to look identical to Duke Gorlois, allowing him to deceive Gorlois's wife, Igraine. From this union based on deception, the famous King Arthur is born. Interestingly, just 15 years later, in 1152, the same author wrote another work entitled Vita Merlini, The Life of Merlin, which ignores the court story and returns to the roots of the Mad Bard. In this version, Merlin lives in the forest, talking to animals and rejecting the court. There is a fascinating anecdote in this text about his powers of clairvoyance. The king wanted to test whether Merlin was really mad or could see the future, so he asked him to predict the death of a child. He said, "He will die from a fall." Days later, they asked him about the same child, and he said, "He will die in a tree." The third time, he said, "He will drown." The king concluded that Merlin was lying since he gave 3 different deaths for a single person. However, fate proved him right. Sometime later, the young man stumbled on a cliff, the fall, his foot got caught in a tree branch, hanging from the tree, and his head was submerged in the river below him, drowned. The 3 prophecies were fulfilled simultaneously. This Merlin was also vengeful. When he decided to retire permanently to the forest, he allowed his wife to remarry on the condition that he would give the groom a gift. On the wedding day, Merlin appeared riding a deer, and upon seeing the new husband, tore off the animal's antlers and threw them with supernatural force, piercing and killing the groom instantly. As you can see, this character is a far cry from Disney's kindly grandfather. We now move forward to the year 1210. Literature needed to align itself with the Christian faith, and writer Robert de Boron decided to connect Merlin with sacred history. Here we are offered a theological explanation for his powers. The story begins in hell, with demons conspiring to create an antichrist who will undo the work of Jesus. They send an incubus demon to impregnate a human woman. However, the mother rushes to baptize the child as soon as she is born. The sacrament cleanses Merlin of evil, but leaves him with the supernatural powers inherited from his demonic father, such as flying and shapeshifting. Basically, he becomes a kind of Hellboy in medieval times, a being of dark origin who chooses to serve the light. It is at this stage that one of the most iconic elements appears. After the king's death, Merlin prophesies that a sign will appear at Christmas, and so it happens. A sword appears stuck in an iron on a stone. Merlin decrees that whoever manages to pull out the sword will be the rightful king, thus beginning Arthur's reign. Over the following centuries, Arthurian legends spread widely, creating what we would now call a cinematic universe, with multiple versions and contradictions, such as the existence of 2 swords, the Sword in the Stone and Excalibur, and different ladies of the lake. In 1485, Sir Thomas Malory compiled these stories in Le Morte d'Arthur. In these later versions, Merlin's fate is sealed by love and betrayal. The great wizard falls madly in love with one of his students, sometimes known as Nimue, Vivian, or Morgana. Although Merlin possesses the gift of prophecy and knows that she will be his undoing, he cannot help but teach her his secrets. Eventually, the student uses a spell that Merlin himself taught her to trap him forever, whether in a cave, a stone tomb, or a tree, removing him from history before Arthur's tragic end. Finally, we arrive in the 20th century. In 1938, author T.H. White wrote the novel The Once and Future King. T.H. White introduces a poetic idea. Merlin lives time backwards. He was born in the future and lives towards the past, becoming younger every day. That is why in the books and adaptations, he sometimes mentions modern inventions like locomotives or helicopters, because for him, they have already happened. The purpose of this modern Merlin is not war, but education and pacifism. He transforms the young Arthur into different animals to teach him that borders are artificial and that war is absurd. It was this novel that Disney adapted in 1963 for the film The Sword in the Stone, removing the final tragedy and leaving us with the image that most of the world loves today. As we have seen, the figure of Merlin has come a long and strange way. He began as a bard traumatized by the bloodshed of a royal battle in 573 AD, transformed into a prophet of dragons in the 11th century, then into the redeemed son of a demon in the 13th century, and finally into the pacifist time traveler of the 20th century. His story has survived for 1,500 years because it adapts to the needs of each era. Sometimes humanity needs a warrior, sometimes it needs to justify its kings, and sometimes it simply needs a wise teacher to remind us that violence is meaningless. That capacity for transformation is perhaps Merlin's true magic. Thank you very much for joining us on this mythical journey. If you enjoyed discovering the true story behind the legend, don't forget to subscribe and leave your comments. See you next time.